Hey, thanks for tuning in to What's Your Signal, where we explore the latest trends in networking, digital transformation, and more. You're joined by me, Taylor Walker, and my co-host, Mauricio Steffen. Hey, Mauricio.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. I'm still coming down from a little bit of laughter. We were watching some videos right before this that were kind of cracking me up. I don't know if I told you this before, but I worked at AT&T for about 10 years, and I was a trainer for some of my time there. And I'd always show our new hires the videos that we were just watching. They were these ads called You Will, and they were from the early 90s that AT&T put together. And basically, in these ads, for those of you listening, they showcase how AT&T predicted we would interact with technology in the future. So it's mostly things that we take for granted, like using a kiosk to buy concert tickets or attending an online class, or what were some of the other random things in there?
Yeah, it's funny how kind of spot on those videos were. I mean, they're 30 years old at this point, and they predicted a lot of the technologies that are just everywhere now, right? For everything from, being able to do, online meetings, video calls via Zoom or Teams or FaceTime, those kind of things, to being able to work from anywhere, to smart home technology, use smart locks and smart lighting in your home, that kind of stuff. Although I did find it funny, though, that they had to kind of keep in some of the technology from the time, right? Because they're showcasing video calls from a phone booth, right? Who remembers what a phone booth is? Or being able to send a fax from the beach, right? I mean, who sends a fax anymore unless you're an accountant or a lawyer, right? So, but for the most part, though, it was pretty spot on for being ads that were 30 years old, as far as, what technology is available and what it can do today.
When we think about what technology can do today, have you had any aha moments with technology where you kind of find yourself thinking, oh my gosh, we're living in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bring up the dark time, but during the pandemic, right, before the pandemic, me and my friends would have a fairly regular poker game, where we'd all just get together and hang out and have a good time. And during the pandemic, we weren't able to do that, right, because everybody was isolating in their homes. And so we all got VR headsets, and we were able to, in virtual reality, replicate our semi-regular poker game. Now, obviously, it's not the same as everybody sitting around a table and joking and have a good time. But for what it was great. I mean, because we're all represented by avatars in virtual reality. But, it was better, a different way of interacting as opposed to just text messages and phone or video calls. And so it was able to kind of, scratch that itch of being able to all get together, even though we couldn't get together in person.
I feel like experiences like that stem from this really long history of networking, and it's fun to look back. That's what we're going to talk about today. And we have a couple of folks here to help us on our journey through the decades. First is Senior Vice President of Cradlepoint Solutions Engineering, Lisa Guess. And from Juniper Networks, we have Product Marketing Director, Christian Gilby. So we're taking this time machine back more than 40 years to the centralized computing era of the 1980s. So y'all know it well, the era of Pac-Man and MTV and E.T. I think earlier Mauricio was telling me he misses when MTV played music videos.
Yeah, I miss when they actually played music videos. I mean, now it's just like reality TV, I think. To be honest, I don't think I've watched MTV in over a couple of decades because they just stopped playing music videos.
That is true. Well, I want to know a little bit more about what the hallmarks of this era were when it came to networking. Christian, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of takes me back a bit to my college days. I remember, today's web browsers using, I think it was called Lynx, and it was basically a text-based web browser. I mean, it's crazy to look at how things have come, video conferencing and, being on the mobile devices everywhere, and we're always connected. And, that was pre-wireless. I mean, wireless, I first came to, back in, what was it, like 99 or so? And it was like 1 or 2 megabits a second. It's crazy how technology's changed.
Lisa, can you think of anything that happened in the 80s that kind of set the stage for future innovations for networking?
Well, I was thinking about this question. I was thinking that's kind of when I started my career back when, back at Shell Oil. And it was funny. My first project was to retire a warehouse full of acoustic coupler modems. So, and you think about
Say that 10 times fast.
Right. So you think about the low bandwidth we had, how primitive the networking was. But, I think about the WAN connections we had. It was such low speed. We had to think a lot about not using much bandwidth. Just even the lead time to connect different sites. I was at the oil company. We had to connect, refineries, and things moved and changed, or, oil production things. And it took months and months to plan ahead. And so that really, we saw the limitations we had for that. But, and so I guess our foundation was we couldn't wait for this to get better. And we saw a whole lot of pain points at the time.
And this was kind of the, like when IBM was the main player. Is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we were in the main, it wasn't necessarily all mainframe. It was, you had IBM and they were the main player, let's say in the business aspect. And then you had a lot of scientific and production areas. And in this era, compute was so expensive and so hard to access. It was really about how critical was your data and how much money could you make with your data and process. Like 3D oil production, you're going to spend untold sums of money on a Cray computer. So we had supercomputing at that time too. And then also the IBM mainframe era. But they were all different platforms doing different, very specific functions.
Yeah, speaking, Lisa, about the speeds too on the WAN. Yeah, I remember, dial-up was like 300 bits per second. And it's like now, like my WAN connection at home is a gig. It's crazy how, the applications have driven it and just the technology innovation, on the interconnectivity. I think it's interesting too. I remember back in college, we didn't have computers. It was like you said, it was a centralized computer. You had a terminal that would basically get timeshares on the computer to actually do processing, like if you wanted to run your program or calculation. Whereas now it really moved to distributed. It's at the edge of the network. I mean, we are seeing some shift, with cloud, where there's now, again, some applications you're sort of centralizing in the cloud. So it's really interesting how things come full circle.
So let's kind of start to take a journey through some of those decades. I want to move up about 10 years from the 80s to the 90s. So that's kind of where we saw the birth of distributed computing. And, not to be forgotten, there was also an epic chase of a white Ford Bronco in Orange County. Maybe we all remember. No? Nobody remembers that. I remember that. And from a networking perspective, what was happening in the 90s that was different from the 80s?
Yeah, I think, the 90s, we saw like the local area network really starting to boom. Things like, I remember, TokenNet, and starting to look at technologies for how you actually route around the LAN and start to interconnect computers. That was certainly something I saw early on.
Yeah, and what's interesting if you think so the 80s, kind of the theme was isolated islands of, you had to just go to a terminal with a very short cable connected to a mainframe, and that was it. You couldn't do anything. So the 90s, we started to get a little more untethered, but it was very, very bifurcated. You had Apple Talk if you had an Apple computer, and you had Token Ring if you had an IBM computer. You had Ethernet if you were on a VAX computer doing scientific research. So, and even some of those technologies had their own proprietary kinds of cabling. Some things needed coax cable, some things needed other things. It was also clunky and very hard to be very flexible. But what we started to see in the 90s was structured wiring, standardized architectures, like you had your centralized wiring closet, then you had your, all the floors had their own wiring closet. All of a sudden we start to feel free and you start to be able to connect more and more.
And what was being connected? When we say we're connecting more and more, what?
Well, the department, so it was interesting. So we had our mainframes, and you were kind of stuck, tethered to that, and then really difficult to connect to it, but you could remotely. And now we started with departmental servers. So each department then, like finance had their server and accounting had a server, HR had a server, and they couldn't talk to each other, and they shouldn't because we didn't have security yet. And I'm sure we'll come talk about security here in a minute. But now all of a sudden we can start to put them on a LAN, and now the buildings can connect from building to building on a corporate LAN. And so that's the type of things that are being connected. And all of a sudden you can start to send email to people in different departments.
So I think another thing that happened in the 90s, which is kind of germane to our industry, is that's when mobile phones became more commercially viable. I don't know if you guys remember kind of the first mobile phones where there's kind of in a bag that you plugged into your car, and it was a car phone. It had to be powered by the vehicle the entire times. But
or it was basically
that's
a backpack, right, of batteries and.
Yeah, I think about, maybe date myself a little bit here, but I remember the Zach Morris Saved by the Bell brick cell phone that was also the kind of the thing in the 90s as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the other thing that is an icon is like, what was it, the Motorola Razr, which was when it started to get more portable, right? That little flip phone that really, I think that was my first phone that I ever had. And yeah, just... it really went fast as well. I think, business was using it. I remember, I was working in college, doing a co-op work term, and, we were out in the field doing networking at different sites. And we had one of those, those backpacks we carried in the car, but it wasn't really, you didn't take it home, right? It was for work. And then, the advent of, the flip phone and the Nokia, like the candy bar phone, you started to see now people were getting it for home, and it really just became pervasive and exploded.
And then also in the 90s, obviously we can't forget to mention is the World Wide Web launched in 91, right? And so how did that impact this era, and what kind of challenges or new roads for innovation do you guys feel like that created?
Well, it opened new ways for us to interact with our customers who might have been all around the world, new ways to support them. They might be able to open a ticket online and we could respond to them a little more quickly. It wasn't all phone calls. It provided some network challenges because all of a sudden, instead of isolated pockets of traffic, now you've got traffic going all over the world, and protocols weren't quite ready for that yet.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we saw too is just like an explosion of, information started now where you companies would start to innovate faster because, they had access to the research easier from like the universities and peer organizations. Even in, I think, the early days when, it was text-based at first. Like I said, I think it was like the Lynx browser I remember using in college. But very quickly, Mozilla, I think that was the first browser that really started to take the world by storm. The dinosaur in the corner of the icon. And then it really ballooned, right? And it became more, rich media that we started to see. And I think that drove networking, right? People were starting to, you had to optimize your images because it just took too long to load them. So it really needed some innovation in the networking side.
And I think we can't forget also, like, it was actually critical, some parts that the government played, especially the NSF, National Science Foundation, because NSFNet was a key thing that kind of paved the way for a World Wide Web, because it showed us the power of all of these scientific organizations and universities collecting their data together and sharing their data instantaneously.
And Christian, like you said, it was kind of ushering things along, and it really brought us into the 2000s, which is where, along with virtualized computing, that's the century that kicked off with Apple introducing the iPod. And in 2001, we saw the deployment of 3G. So up to the 2000s, I'm curious, were there certain industries that maybe saw more significant changes or benefits due to past networking advancements? I guess what I'm trying to say is, were there maybe people who couldn't really play in this field until the 2000s hit and they had access to something like 3G?
Well, I would say, the distributed environments where there were large budgets and really either critical or highly valuable data really were ready to benefit. I think about, like I said earlier, scientific computing. Even things, though, like retail computing start to become more affordable. So if you even go back to the early 90s, retail was really having a challenge trying to do point of sale, and they were ripe for it, but they also needed low cost. So we start to see the pace change a bit because things start to become more affordable as we're getting 3G and getting a little more technology, which we'll see a huge tidal wave of that coming later, which we'll get to in a minute.
So one thing in the 2000s that I can recall is that this is when mainframes are replaced by kind of these rack after rack of servers, right? There's server farms and virtual machines as enterprises begin centralizing some of their applications. And so the need for routing and encryption arises, as does MPLS as a reliable connectivity solution. And so can we talk a little bit about that? So what roles did VPN and MPLS play in the 2000s?
Yeah, so I think, that was when we started to see a lot more of this branch interconnectivity. And, there were two solutions. One was, MPLS. We also saw ATM, I think, before MPLS, to really do basically at the telco side, really, connecting and basically having these private routed networks between the branches. The other technology was, you mentioned VPN, where, businesses were looking at using the internet to actually interconnect those, but you had to secure the traffic between the sites. So yeah, I think, that was kind of where things were going. I mean, before that, we also had things like, lease lines like T1, T3, where they'd interconnect, where it was, a static route between the sites.
Yeah, these things were like really game changing. MPLS, it has a soft spot in my heart. Because I was, that's really where I saw the affordability of wide area networking come to the masses. And you have MPLS because you could do a lot more efficient sharing of an overall network infrastructure. It's also where the carrier service providers were able to really monetize their networks to the maximum extent, because they went from a very fixed SONET infrastructure to this much more flexible MPLS infrastructure, and lead times to deploy became much, much quicker. And the humble VPN, I think it's hard to overstate the impact that made on the networking industry. So easily we think, I go to the airport, I go home, I go wherever I am, I'm at my grandparents' house, whatever, and I'm on a VPN and it's secure and private. But that came along at this time so that now we can securely connect and tunnel through basically any kind of network.
Yeah, and the revolution in that interconnectivity, right, brought a lot of new industries, right? Because the 2000s was the dawn of social media, right? And without the ability to virtualize the computing and have that ubiquitous interconnectivity amongst servers, whether they're located, wouldn't bring about industries, good, bad, or indifferent, such as social media, right? A lot of those technologies, or a lot of technology advances like that, are just built on, that the ability to have that connectivity.
There were so many things exploding during this time. I mean, yeah, like you were saying, Mauricio, MySpace, Facebook, so social media, and then the first iPhone came out in 2007. And so connectedness, the early 2000s were a big time for staying connected. And once we made it through those early 2000s and kind of came out on the other side to the 2010s, where centralized cloud computing sort of took center stage, we saw the proliferation of 4G in the early, it was 2009 when it was first deployed, and then the launch of 5G. So what impact did those generations of cellular connectivity have on networking?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, back in, a bit after the iPhone, I was at a startup that was basically, taking the office phone onto the mobile, be it, iPhone, BlackBerry, Nokia, what have you. And there was this, this shift that we saw, like a lot of people were starting, wanting to be able to work anywhere. It's kind of started, had salespeople everywhere, but it started to be like knowledge workers as well, wanted to be able to access basically my office is me, wherever I am, right? And the technologies were, really enabling that. The VPN, this was kind of pulling them together, right? You've got the VPN technology, Now you've got, 3G, 4G, and then later on 5G to actually, interconnect you from the phone. So really saw, I think, an explosion there of, not just now distribution of the offices, but also the people, aren't necessarily, connected from the office all the time. So you'd have teleworkers or road warriors really start to use the technology.
That was really powerful. I don't know if any of you remember, what was this, about the early, the late 2000s, when if you got to your airline club, you had to find something and plug into an Ethernet or figure out how to, it was hard to connect. But, I also think about that time, it changed some things fundamentally. Now we can do ride sharing. This is when Uber came to be. I remember my very first Uber ride ever. I was in San Francisco and they had just launched it. And, everybody was like, what are you doing? That's crazy. You call a car and here it comes. and I think about, now our airplane tickets are on our phone. We couldn't do that until we all had 4G and the capability and leading into 5G.
Lisa, you said MPLS has a soft spot in your heart. What was happening to that during this time, especially when IoT was starting to grow and is continuing to grow? What's happening to some of those traditional forms of connectivity?
Well, they're starting to evolve as well. So, if I look from my perspective, so we're in the 10s. So if I think about, that's kind of when I came to Cradlepoint Ericsson, and now we're starting to see the promise of 5G on the horizon. Back in, let's say around 2018, we're starting to talk about it. Yeah. 4G is really coming into maturity. And all of a sudden, now anything that can become wireless, that possibility starts to exist. So now we're almost looking at MPLS as, okay, now we're going to evolve that into a wireless WAN that gives us even more flexibility. And now we look at kiosks to now have full capability. Anything that's moving around, machines, robots, any kind of vehicle, factory, warehouses, it's really startling, all of the things that connectivity opened up to be able now to communicate with us and with each other.
With all those possibilities and thinking about all the applications and things that kind of exploded with 4G, LTE, 5G, there's also a lot of challenges that come with that and a lot of fears. And so what were some of those challenges or points of trepidation for enterprise businesses?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that, we were starting to see, is, IT administrators now, they've got to deal with a lot of different technologies, right? Everything's, it's great stuff, right? But they've got to manage it all, right? And, when things go wrong, employees complain, they've got to figure it out. So I think that was a challenge that we started to see for sure is, how do you get the insight and understand what's going on? A lot of times it was heterogeneous networks. Some of the technologies may be run by the enterprise, some may be the service provider. And I think that was one of the challenges when things go wrong. How do you find the root cause? Where's the problem and get it resolved so the network's up and running? I think that was certainly a big thing. It enabled just this rapid growth of different technologies, but you've got to support them as an IT team.
That is indeed, Christian, when manageability became key, and now all of a sudden you've got retail with 20,000, 30,000, hundreds of thousands of global branches. And if something goes wrong, how do I find that and manage that? That was definitely a concern. I think also just reliability of cellular, that was a concern. And is it available everywhere? Like if I'm in the middle of nowhere, can I use cellular for all my branch sites? I don't know. Is it ever, and what we found is a lot of these fears were somewhat true, but not as true as might have been thought. Another concern with 4G that I think 5G is helping solve is data plans and the price performance of your data plan compared to the amount of data you need to transmit.
I think this time, as the ubiquity of connectivity and it was driving a lot of technology into the business, I think, Lisa, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. I think about this time, the 2010s, is where security concerns and privacy concerns started to become more of a concern, right? I don't want to say that, bad actors just started to come into the picture, because I think as long as we have had connected devices, there's been people who are trying to gain unauthorized access to them. But I think about this is about the time where those things started to get very publicized, because it was more of a mentality of connect first and secure second. What do you guys think about that thought as far as in the 2010s?
Yeah, I think the other thing, like in addition to that, was just the number of entry points into an enterprise was growing, right? You had all these mobile devices. IoT was really just in its infancy starting to come out there, where you had a lot of these headless devices start to come out. And I think, people hadn't thought through, what are the security concerns with those? They were more concerned with, it's a sensor or some low power, low cost device. How do we optimize that? So I think a lot of shortcuts were taken on building the security infrastructures into those IoT devices. So I think that was a challenge. It was like more attack surfaces basically coming into the enterprise.
Definitely. Like I think about, the infamous fish tank that hacked like an entire financial infrastructure that somebody got in through the fish tank sensor. Things you don't think about, but now that everything's connected, it's very important to think about.
I mean, within the early 2000s, let's say to, the end of the late 2010s, how has troubleshooting and network manageability changed, or what has changed specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was, in that time frame, there was a big push to really try and, pull the data into, a single or a smaller set of management platforms so that you could, get the data to look at the analytics. I think a bit later we'll talk to sort of AI, but, that was kind of later on. But I think in that, 2010 time frame, it was more about, pull it into a, the holy grail being a single pane of glass, right? Being able to look, across, even if you've got multi-vendor solutions, be able to pull things together and look at it. That was what I think a lot of companies were chasing to try and get that insight and run the network.
And I think exactly. And I think, if you look at the 2010s, there was such a dependability on, I'm going to telnet in and I'm going to do CLI, and then very quickly that became unscalable. And so then you did need that single pane of glass. You needed management systems, which is going to quickly lead us to we start to do primitive scripting, primitive automation, and now look where we're going, as Chris is already talking about with AI management.
One thing with network management too that I believe, and Lisa, Christian, you can correct me if I'm wrong on my date here, but I think in the 2010s, that's when SD-WAN also started to solidify. Can you guys talk a little bit about that and what that was and what it kind of did for networking?
Well, if you think about, so SDN, software-defined networking, was one of the precursors, and that was more within, the core of your network, which was powerful. But then we realized the tremendous power of software-defined wide area networking, so that now you could leverage these very expensive, long connections, whether it's over cellular or, it's a landline, it's whatever it might be, microwave. And now you can leverage and put your data over what's the right price transport for the amount of criticality of it. So SD-WAN is a true game changer, but you also have to be able to manage it very easily and effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, two of the big things SD-WAN brought, because before that, VPN would solve connecting branches over the internet, but, I think what it lacked was this routing capability and the software-defined capability. Like with SD-WAN, now you can, for example, you could source two links from different service providers to have some redundancy, or maybe it's applications, have one link which has less latency, so you route your VoIP traffic through there. And I think SD-WAN brought that flexibility where the network now, has the smarts to route a different connection and even out to wireless WAN. So not just relying on, the wired connections, but you can also use the wireless WAN for that.
And I think all of that is really bringing us into where we are today, and I want to say like the 2020s, but I feel like just saying 2020 is almost synonymous with the pandemic at this point. But we're beginning to associate this time frame more with things like ChatGPT and cryptocurrency and AI. And this is really the era of hybrid cloud computing. and wireless WAN. And so how do you guys feel that the relationship between machines and humans has been changing during the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, for me, and when I joined, Mist, which was the foundation of our Juniper Mist AI-driven solution, it was founded really starting around leveraging AI to operate the network. And I think, early days there was a lot of fear. Is AI going to take jobs of IT managers? I think the reality is, and messaging is, no. It's basically an enabler, right? You've got more devices coming into the network. AI helps you, manage more devices, more apps, without having to double, triple your team to do that. So I think, that's been one of the big things. I think the other thing with all these applications coming in, it's a lot of data for a person to hunt through. Like if you have somebody manually troubleshooting. And I think that is, one of the big powers of AI and data science is basically take this large amount of data, distill it down into, is it good? Is it bad? And when things are bad, what's causing the problem? And you mentioned the pandemic. I think that's been an accelerator in terms of apps. Like we've seen, in our customers, a lot more video use. Video's been around forever. I think 2 companies ago, I was doing a unified communications startup, but it didn't take off fully. There were pockets of people that were using it. I think through the pandemic now, I go on to calls today and people are on video, where it wasn't the default before. People would join audio and occasionally, you'd be on video. Now I think the default mode is most people are doing video, and that's, it's driven up the bandwidth demands, both on the LAN as well as the WAN and wireless WAN. And then just the number of devices that we're seeing coming in and interconnected.
And there is so much more video, and it's not just the traffic bandwidth, which is key. It's also, how do I process this much AI video? Or video, and you need AI. I think about a simple example being a train. So you've got trains and they have cameras that are looking at the wheels up the train, trying to detect, is the camber right? Is it starting to wobble? Because I want to prevent a train derailment. Well, no human can look at every wheel of every train in the country, but AI now can look at that and go, this train needs to have service. And now you're seeing real dollar impacts and societal impacts that AI will bring for the benefit for all of us.
One thing I think about as we're talking through these different changes through each of the decades is if we don't learn our history, we're doomed to repeat it, right? Or something like that. So are there some fundamental principles or lessons that were learned in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s that still hold relevance today despite all of the changes that have taken place since then?
I mean, a big one that jumps out for me is, standards-based and interoperability. And that was something, in the 80s, the 90s, it was, we saw occasionally there was technologies that came out and it was proprietary. And, in the long run, it just didn't prove out. So I think that's something that we've certainly learned is you've got to be, leverage standards-based where you can and build open platforms where you can integrate with other vendors, because it's rare to find a solution that's going to be single vendor, right? You want to get best in breed across vendors. So part of that is us working together, right?
I think that's so important, interoperability. And that's a hard balance to make, though, of being interoperability, which might imply standards-based. It might. But then that also, does that slow you down or limit you? Because now we want to innovate even faster and faster. So I think both. But I think, surprisingly, technologists have found a way to come together over the years, over the decades, and really innovate together for the greater good. Another thing that I think about that we should always keep in mind, I don't know if we've learned it, but we've suffered from it. Don't ever forget the end user. Don't ever do technology for just because it's cool. Do something because it solves a business problem. Make sure you bring the end user along with you. Make sure you're not making things overly complex. And I think those fundamentals are key to us having success as we evolve technology.
So maybe want to ask you guys to put your prognostication hats on, and like Taylor mentioned, AI, cryptocurrency, those kind of technologies are starting to inform the early part of this decade. If you were to kind of think about, the rest of this decade and moving into the next one, what do you think those key technologies are going to be? Or what do you think, use cases or you mentioned Uber being driven by the ubiquity of smartphones and 4G and social media being driven by the interconnectivity, like with 5G, with SD-WAN, those kind of things. What do you kind of think that those technologies are going to drive for the next decade or so?
Well, I'll jump in. I think about, so I think 5G is really a foundation for everything being connected. Now, I'm admittedly biased, but I go on vacation somewhere and the tour bus has a device in it that's a cellular router, and you think about what all these kinds of things enable and where they are. But I think AI is going to fundamentally change our networking industry as well. And I mean, AI is such a big topic. I think as we're thinking about it in this group, we got to focus on what does AI do for networking, and what it does. It's better network management. It's better problem solving. It's more preventive maintenance. It's AI operations in every way. It's going to impact how we can solve security threats. And I mean, for goodness sakes, if we don't have great AI to combat bad AI in security threats, we're lost. So there's so much greatness coming, I think, that AI will bring into the networking industry and take us to 2030 and beyond.
Yeah, I think that's, a great perspective. I think AI is here. We've seen some of the early benefits that, it can really deliver for networking. I think, harnessing it even further, I think one of the areas that I think is somewhere, customers need to invest is how to leverage AI and make the most of it, right? Because, the technology's there now, but I think one of the gaps is a skills gap of, as customers, A, evaluate AI solutions, but then B, how they harness it in their business, how they can differentiate against their competition. So I think that's something that, as a customer, you really should be looking at is, how do you upskill your team to make the most of AI and for the network, but also other parts of your business.
Christian and Lisa, we've talked a lot about obviously looking into the future and future proofing. And just from a personal perspective, I'm curious, are there any technologies that didn't make the cut that you guys are kind of like bummed about, even if it's something kind of cheesy? But I think about all the time that you've been in these industries, and is there something you remember that was like, could have been there, but it flopped and you just sort of wish it kept going on, or something that we might still need?
I mean, I think the one buzz one for me is virtual reality. I mean, we've seen some of it used in, entertainment space, but I think in terms of helping, real world problems, I actually expected it to take off a little more than it has. There is stuff going on in that space, but it kind of didn't deliver on, what was being, hyped up, I think.
Boy, I'm trying to think of something. All I can think of is robot lawnmower or something.
Right?
No, I don't know. I think so many things we couldn't even imagine be even more so than we think. But I think VR, I'm still waiting to see the promise of it. But on the other hand, I look at how long ago we had video conferencing available. If you actually go back to the 50s, that was possible, and it took until the pandemic for it to be. So I think the promise will still be, which is probably a good point. You didn't even ask this, but sometimes these technologies take way longer to be adopted broadly than you ever would dream they would.
Well, yeah, you think about the market not being ready for technology, because Apple had a smartphone long before the iPhone, even long before the iPad. It escapes me off the top of my head what they called it, but they had a smartphone back in the, I think, 80s or 90s, and it just, the market, the the infrastructure just wasn't ready for it. Like Lisa, like you mentioned, video calling is just something that there wasn't a problem that it needed to solve. VR, I think AR is becoming more applicable than VR is, because it does not necessarily solve a problem, but presents interesting opportunities. Like, when you're in a store, being able to use AR to overlay the specifications for a product as opposed to having to go onto your smartphone and look those up. So, it is interesting how sometimes technology evolves faster than the problem it needs to solve presents itself.
Well, Christian, Lisa, we've taken a lot of your time, and I know your schedules are busy, especially this time of year. So before we end, Christian, can you tell us a little bit more about Juniper and where our listeners can find out more information about Juniper?
Yeah, so I'm part of our AI-driven enterprise portfolio. So basically what we deliver is solutions for wired, wireless, SD-WAN that leverage AI. And why AI? It's all about delivering a better experience for users, for devices, and the IT teams that are running the networks. Basically leverage AI to simplify, running the network and keeping it up and running well. So that's really, our big focus on the enterprise side. I mean, we have other solutions for service provider, but I'm really focused on the enterprise side, and it's exciting times. Just in terms of, all these applications coming in, they all need a network, and both in the LAN as well as the WAN, and that's, I think, one of the things that's driven our companies to come together and really, work together on solutions.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I think what I was really struck by as I'm thinking through the decades, and you can almost, it's funny, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but you can almost hear it even in like the cadence of how we were all four talking together, but things get exponentially faster as time goes on. And it's kind of why, do you understand what I'm saying? It's just, it's interesting to feel that and to see it and to talk about it, how it's just this slower movement and then it gains momentum. And now it's almost like we can't keep up with how fast things are changing. Well,
yeah. I mean, you think about that, especially something that's really germane to our industry, right? You think about when cellular networks first became a thing, right? That was in the 70s. And, if you think of that as 1G, we had that for probably a decade or more, probably closer to 2 decades before it moved to 2G and then 3G. And then you start to see that time shrink so much so, right? 5G became a thing in 2019 is when the first 5G networks. And here at Ericsson, we're already talking about developing the standards for 6G. And it's only been 5 years. Now, that means, it'll probably be another 5 years before standards for 6G and the first 6G network get rolled out. But you're exactly right. As those time frames are starting to get more and more compressed, and you start to see more revolution than evolution, right? Mm-hmm. Bigger leaps of technology. And you just think about the industries that are spawned off of the advances of technology, right? You think about today, you think about things like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart. These were things that didn't even exist. Now, we had taxi cabs and we had pizza delivery, and I even remember when KFC used to deliver. But they were things that the restaurant themselves had to do, right? They had to hire their own drivers. They had to take care of all those logistics. And, I'll date myself a little bit, but in high school, I used to deliver pizzas, and we had a giant map of our pizza delivery area, and I had to memorize the route of where each delivery had to go based on like cross streets and finding it on the map and hoping I didn't get lost on the way to the customer's house. Yeah. And luckily, I'm not so old that I didn't have a cell phone and couldn't, call the customer or call the store if I ended up in a spot where I couldn't do it. But yeah, you think about like technologies and things that today in our everyday life only exist because of the evolution of networking. In fact, I'll pull the curtain back a little bit for our listeners, but we're not all in the same room, right? Lisa is where Lisa's at, and I assume she doesn't live with Christian, but Christian is where he's located, and you and I are in the same room here in Boise. And we're able to have that well-flowing conversation over great distances, whereas even trying to do that on the phone without the cues of video is even difficult. So just having the connectivity and having the ability to do that is completely different. I mean, this format, the podcast format, would not even exist without the evolution of networking, because who wants to wait 4 to 6 weeks for Columbia Clearinghouse to send you the cassette of the Wireless WAN podcast?
I think
right?
I still have an outstanding balance from forgetting to unsubscribe to that.
19 CDs for a penny.
That's
right.
Well, thank you all for joining us on What's Your Signal. If you like what you heard today and you want to keep learning more about networking and the innovations that go along with it, we invite you to rate, subscribe, and share our podcast, and visit cradlepoint.com for more details.